I clutched my worn suitcase handle as my father's voice thundered through the falling snow. "You've embarrassed this family for the last time, Sarah." The massive oak door of my childhood home slammed shut, leaving me stranded on Christmas Eve in a blizzard that was already dumping 3 inches per hour across upstate New York. My sister Jennifer's mocking laughter echoed from behind the frosted windows as she called out, "Let's see how you manage without Daddy's money now." I stumbled to a snow-covered park bench, shivering uncontrollably when I spotted a barefoot woman with purple skin sitting motionless nearby. Without hesitation, I pulled off my winter boots and handed them to her. 60 minutes later, 19 black BMWs surrounded us both, and the woman spoke one sentence that changed everything. The morning had started with such hope. As I drove my battered Honda Civic through the winding roads of Saratoga Springs toward my parents' estate, snow began falling gently around 11 o'clock, creating the perfect Christmas card backdrop that I thought might soften their hearts after our year-long estrangement. My stomach churned with nervous anticipation as I pulled through the wrought iron gates that separated the Clark family mansion from the ordinary world. The circular driveway, lined with perfectly manicured evergreens, draped in white lights, led to a colonial revival house that commanded respect from everyone who saw it. Growing up here had been both a privilege and a prison, surrounded by luxury, but suffocated by expectations I could never meet. At 28, I had chosen a path that horrified my real estate developer parents, struggling artist, and part-time waitress living in a studio apartment above a coffee shop in Albany. While my older sister, Jennifer, had followed the prescribed route of law school, corporate success, and marriage to an investment banker, I had pursued my passion for painting despite the financial uncertainty it brought. The family gathering was already in full swing when I rang the doorbell. Through the sidelights, I could see Jennifer's twin boys, ages 6 and 8, racing around the foyer in their matching Christmas sweaters, while her husband, David, stood near the fireplace discussing stock portfolios with my father. The scene looked like something from a luxury catalog, all perfectly coordinated and expensive. My mother, Margaret, answered the door wearing an emerald silk dress that probably cost more than I earned in 3 months. Her expression shifted from surprise to disappointment as she took in my appearance, secondhand wool, coat scuff boots, and paint stains under my fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. "Sarah," she said stiffly, making no move to invite me inside, "we weren't expecting you." "I called last week and left a message about Christmas dinner, Bugsy," I replied, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "I thought maybe we could try again." Jennifer appeared behind our mother, her perfect blonde hair styled in expensive waves that framed her smug expression. She wore a designer red dress that emphasized her successful, professional image, everything I was supposed to be, but had disappointed them by refusing to become. "Look what the cat dragged in," Jennifer said with false sweetness. "Did you finally get tired of playing starving artist?" My father, Robert, emerged from the living room, his face already flushed with anger that I recognized from countless previous confrontations. At 62, he commanded respect through intimidation and financial power, building his real estate empire by crushing anyone who stood in his way. What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "After what you pulled at that gallery show, you have some nerve showing up at our home." The gallery show. 3 weeks ago, my art exhibition titled Foundations of Greed had opened at a small Albany gallery featuring paintings that depicted the human cost of urban development. My work highlighted displaced families, destroyed neighborhoods, and environmental damage caused by aggressive real estate practices. I had never specifically mentioned Clark real estate, but the local media had made the connection immediately. Those paintings were about systemic issues in development, Dad. I never targeted our family specifically. Bullshit. Robert's face turned crimson as he stepped closer. His intimidation tactics that worked in boardrooms now directed at his own daughter. The Albany Times-Union ran a full-page article about your courageous artistic commentary on local development practices with a photo of you standing next to a painting that looked exactly like the Riverside Apartments project. You made us look like slumlords. Jennifer smirked as she added fuel to the fire. Not just slumlords, Dad. The article mentioned how certain prominent local developers prioritize profits over community welfare. Everyone knows they meant Clark Real Estate. My heart sank as I realized the true scope of their anger. My art had inadvertently shone a spotlight on their business practices in ways I hadn't intended, creating exactly the kind of negative publicity that could damage their reputation among wealthy clients. I was trying to start a conversation about social responsibility in development. I protested weakly. I never meant to hurt the family business. Margaret stepped forward with ice-cold fury. Your intentions don't matter, Sarah. The damage is done. We've already lost 2 major contracts because clients don't want to be associated with controversial developers who might face public scrutiny. David, Jennifer's husband, cleared his throat uncomfortably from the doorway. Even he seemed disturbed by the level of venom being directed at me, though he wisely stayed silent rather than defend someone who could hurt his own financial interests. You've always been selfish and irresponsible. Robert continued, his voice rising to a shout that made his grandchildren peek around the corner with frightened expressions. First, you waste your college education on useless art classes, then you embarrass us by working as a waitress, and now you attack the business that paid for everything you've ever had. The accusations stung because they contained enough truth to be devastating. I had disappointed them repeatedly by choosing passion over profit, creativity over conformity, authenticity over approval. But I had never intended to sabotage their livelihood or damage relationships that took decades to build. I'm sorry the exhibition caused problems, I said quietly, hoping humility might diffuse their rage. I came here tonight because it's Christmas and I miss being part of this family. Jennifer laughed with genuine cruelty. Miss being part of the family? You rejected this family the day you decided to become a bohemian failure instead of someone we could be proud of. Her words hit like physical blows, each one precisely calculated to inflict maximum emotional damage. This was the sister who had shared my bedroom for 16 years, who had once been my closest friend, before success turned her into someone I barely recognized. Robert reached a decision that would haunt him forever. Get your things and get out. You're not welcome in this house anymore, and you're not part of this family. Maybe sleeping in the snow will teach you some appreciation for the security you threw away. He disappeared briefly and returned with my old suitcase, the same one I had taken to college 8 years earlier. It contained the few belongings I had left at their house over the years, childhood mementos, old photo albums, and a few pieces of clothing that no longer fit my current lifestyle. "Dad, please," I pleaded, as the wind picked up outside, sending snowflakes swirling against the windows. "It's Christmas Eve and there's a blizzard coming. Can't we just talk about this?" The time for talking ended when you decided to publicly attack everything your mother and I built, Robert replied coldly. Jennifer is right. Let's see how you manage without family support. Margaret handed me my coat without meeting my eyes, her expression carved from granite that revealed no trace of maternal concern. These people who had raised me, fed me, and housed me for 18 years were casting me out into a dangerous storm without a moment's hesitation. Jennifer delivered the final blow as I stepped onto the porch. Maybe this will finally teach you that your artistic principles don't pay for heat or food. When you're ready to apologize and join the real world, we might consider letting you back." The door slammed with finality that echoed through the falling snow. I stood on the porch for several minutes, hoping someone would relent and invite me back inside. Instead, I watched through the windows as they returned to their celebration, my absence already forgotten as David poured champagne and the children resumed their games. Walking away from that house felt like leaving my entire identity behind. Every step through the deepening snow carried me further from the only life I had ever known toward an uncertain future that terrified me more than I wanted to admit. The wind cut through my wool coat like it was made of paper, and within minutes, my fingers were numb despite my gloves. The nearest hotel was 12 miles away, and my Honda had been making concerning noises that suggested it might not survive the trip through this storm. That's when I spotted the park bench ahead and the figure huddled on it who would change my life in ways I could never have imagined. The Saratoga Springs Municipal Park looked like a frozen wasteland as I trudged through snow that was already ankle-deep and rising fast. Street lamps created islands of yellow light in the swirling darkness, and the temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since I left my parents' house 30 minutes ago. My suitcase wheels kept jamming with ice, forcing me to drag it behind me, while my feet grew increasingly numb inside boots that had seemed adequate when I left Albany, but felt pathetically insufficient now. The weather forecast had mentioned possible snow, but this blizzard was turning into something far more dangerous than anyone had predicted. That's when I saw her. A woman sat motionless on a park bench near the frozen duck pond, her dark hair whipping in the wind and her skin taking on a frightening purple hue that indicated advanced hypothermia. She wore thin cotton pants and a lightweight jacket that provided virtually no protection against the brutal cold. But what shocked me most was her complete lack of footwear. Her bare feet were pressed against the concrete, surrounded by snow that was accumulating faster every minute. Even from 20 feet away, I could see her toes turning dangerous colors that meant tissue damage was already occurring. She seemed barely conscious, swaying slightly as if fighting to stay upright. Every instinct told me to hurry past and focus on my own survival, but something about her stillness reminded me of a sculpture depicting human suffering. As an artist, I had spent years studying expressions of pain and endurance, and this woman embodied both in ways that made my chest ache with recognition. I approached cautiously, unsure whether she was mentally ill under the influence of drugs or simply too far gone from cold exposure to make rational decisions. Her eyes tracked my movement with intelligence that suggested awareness. Despite her deteriorating physical condition, "Ma'am," I called softly, not wanting to startle someone who might be experiencing medical crisis. "Are you okay?" She looked up with dark eyes that seemed far older than her face suggested. Her features indicated Eastern European heritage, with high cheekbones and olive skin that was currently mottled with dangerous discoloration from the cold. When she spoke, her accent was thick and her words came slowly as if English required tremendous effort. "I am managing," she replied, though her voice shook with cold that made normal conversation nearly impossible. "Ma'am, you need to get somewhere warm immediately," I said, setting down my suitcase and sitting beside her on the bench. "Your feet are going to get frostbite if they're not protected soon." She studied my face with intensity that seemed to look beyond my current appearance into something deeper. Despite her obvious vulnerability, her gaze carried authority that suggested she was accustomed to being in control of situations rather than at their mercy. You also have nowhere warm to go, she observed with startling accuracy. Why do you concern yourself with stranger when you face same danger? Her question cut straight to the heart of my situation. I was indeed homeless myself, cast out by family, and facing the same life-threatening weather conditions. Logic suggested I should focus entirely on my own survival rather than taking responsibility for someone I had just met. But looking at her bare feet surrounded by accumulating snow, I couldn't walk away from someone suffering when I had something that might help. My boots wouldn't solve all her problems, but they might prevent amputation or worse complications from frostbite. Here, I said, pulling off my winter boots without allowing myself time to reconsider. Take these. Your need is greater than mine. Her eyes widened with surprise as I placed the boots beside her on the bench. They were good quality leather, with thick soles and warm lining purchased during better financial times when I could afford proper winter gear. I cannot accept, she protested, though her hands reached toward the boots despite her words. You will suffer from cold without protection. I'll figure something out, I replied, though I had no idea what that might involve. But if you don't get your feet covered soon, you might lose them permanently. She slipped the boots on with obvious relief, and I watched color begin returning to her extremities as the warm lining provided insulation her body desperately needed. The fit was nearly perfect, suggesting we shared similar shoe sizes despite our very different circumstances. Why? She asked, simply, her accent making the question sound more profound than it might have in American English. Why give help to stranger when you need help yourself? I considered the question while pulling my coat more tightly around my now freezing feet, because suffering alone is worse than suffering together. And because maybe kindness is the only thing that makes us human when everything else gets stripped away. Something shifted in her expression, as if my answer had satisfied some test I wasn't aware of taking. She reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a cell phone that looked far more expensive than anything a homeless person should possess. You give kindness to stranger, she said, dialing a number with hands that were still shaking from cold. Now stranger gives gift in return. She spoke rapidly in a language I didn't recognize, her tone carrying urgency and authority that seemed at odds with her vulnerable position on the park bench. The conversation lasted several minutes, with her occasionally glancing at me while providing what sounded like detailed instructions. When she ended the call, her entire demeanor changed. The fragility that had characterized her minutes earlier was replaced by confidence that suggested hidden depths I was only beginning to glimpse. Help comes soon, she announced, checking an expensive watch that I hadn't noticed earlier. We wait together, and then your life changes in ways you cannot imagine. The cryptic statement puzzled me, but I was too cold and exhausted to demand explanations. We sat in companionable silence as the snow continued falling around us, two women from completely different worlds sharing a park bench on the worst night of both our lives. What's your name? I asked, trying to keep conversation going to stay alert in the dangerous cold. Katerina, she replied. And you are Sarah Clark, daughter of Robert and Margaret Clark, artist who paints truth about powerful people who harm others for money. Her knowledge of my identity shocked me into silence. How could a homeless woman know specific details about my family background and recent art exhibition? The implications suggested surveillance or research that made no sense given her apparent circumstances. How do you know about my paintings? I asked, suddenly wary of this stranger I had tried to help. Katerina smiled for the first time since I had met her, and the expression transformed her face completely. Instead of a helpless victim of circumstances, she looked like someone accustomed to having her questions answered immediately, and her instructions followed without hesitation. Because Sarah Clark, I have been looking for someone exactly like you for many months. She said her accent somehow less pronounced now that she wasn't fighting hypothermia. Someone with talent, integrity, and courage to challenge corruption, even when it costs personal relationships. Before I could respond to her puzzling statement, the sound of powerful engines approached through the storm. Multiple vehicles were converging on our location, their headlights cutting through the swirling snow like searchlights hunting for something specific. What happened next would transform my understanding of everything I thought I knew about help power and the woman whose feet I had just saved. The rumble of approaching engines grew louder as vehicle after vehicle emerged from the blizzard, like something from an action movie. I counted 19 identical black BMWs, forming a perfect circle around our park bench, their headlights creating a wall of light that turned the falling snow into a glittering curtain. My heart hammered with terror as I realized I had somehow stumbled into a situation far beyond my understanding. Were these drug dealers, human traffickers, government agents conducting some kind of operation? Every possibility seemed dangerous for two homeless women who had witnessed whatever was about to unfold. "Katerina, we need to run," I whispered urgently, grabbing her arm and preparing to flee despite my bare feet and the impossibility of outrunning vehicles in deep snow. She remained perfectly calm, placing a steady hand on my shoulder with the confidence of someone who had expected exactly this development. "Sarah, you are safe. These people work for me." Her words made no sense. Homeless women didn't command convoys of luxury vehicles or coordinate military precision operations in municipal parks. But before I could voice my confusion, car doors began opening simultaneously, revealing figures that confirmed this was no ordinary rescue operation. Men and women in identical dark coats emerged from each vehicle, moving with disciplined coordination that indicated extensive training and clear command structure. They weren't threatening, but their efficiency suggested capabilities that could become dangerous if circumstances warranted different approaches. A tall woman with short gray hair approached our bench, speaking to Katerina in the same language I had heard during the phone call. Their conversation was brief, but clearly deferential, with the newcomer providing status updates and seeking instructions rather than offering assistance to someone in need. Katerina stood and began removing my boots, preparing to return them, despite the freezing conditions that still threatened her health. I started to protest, but she held up a hand that somehow commanded immediate silence. Sarah Clark. She said, her English now perfectly fluent, without any trace of the accent that had characterized her earlier speech. "Allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Katerina Volkov, and I am the majority shareholder of Volkov International, which owns manufacturing facilities, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios across 17 countries." The transformation was so complete that I wondered if I was hallucinating from cold exposure. The vulnerable woman who had been facing hypothermia 20 minutes earlier now spoke with authority that made hardened professionals wait respectfully for her commands. "You're not homeless?" I said, stupidly still trying to process information that challenged everything I had observed. "I am temporarily without permanent residence in your country," Katerina replied with a slight smile. "But homeless, no. I have been conducting what you Americans call field research into business practices and social conditions in upstate New York, specifically related to real estate development and treatment of vulnerable populations." One of her associates handed her a tablet computer and began explaining something in urgent whispers. Katerina reviewed whatever information they provided, her expression growing more serious as she scrolled through documents that appeared to contain financial data and legal paperwork. For 3 months, I have been investigating Clark Real Estate and your family's business operations. She continued, her attention divided between the tablet and my stunned reaction. What I discovered necessitated additional research into the character and integrity of family members before making final determinations about legal actions. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't a chance encounter between two desperate women seeking shelter from a storm. Katerina had orchestrated our meeting as part of some elaborate investigation into my family's business practices, and I had unknowingly participated in whatever test she had been conducting. "You've been watching me," I accused, feeling manipulated and betrayed despite the kindness she had shown during our conversation. "I have been watching your entire family," Katerina confirmed without apology. "Your parents' business practices include systematic violation of housing codes, discriminatory rental policies, tax evasion through offshore accounts, and environmental violations that endanger community health. Your sister Jennifer has provided legal counsel that enabled these activities while maintaining plausible deniability." My stomach dropped as she laid out accusations that painted my family as criminal conspirators rather than successful developers who occasionally cut corners. If her claims were accurate, their anger about my art exhibition made perfect sense. I had inadvertently exposed activities they desperately needed to keep hidden. "But you," Katerina continued studying my face intently, "have remained separate from these operations despite family pressure to join the business. Your art exhibition demonstrated willingness to challenge corrupt practices, even when it cost personal relationships. Tonight's events confirmed your character in ways that no amount of surveillance could reveal. Another associate approached with an expensive wool coat and lined boots that fit perfectly, suggesting they had researched even my clothing sizes during their investigation. The efficiency of their preparation indicated months of planning rather than spontaneous assistance. The boots you gave me represented genuine sacrifice," Katerina explained, as I gratefully put on the warm footwear. "You had nothing to gain and everything to lose by helping a stranger, yet you chose compassion over self-preservation. That choice demonstrates exactly the moral character I need in a business partner." "Business partner," I repeated weakly, overwhelmed by revelations that had transformed a simple act of kindness into something far more complex. Katerina handed me the tablet, displaying financial documents that showed the scope of Volkov International's operations. Real estate developments across Europe and Asia, manufacturing facilities, employing thousands of workers' investment portfolios worth billions of dollars. Her company was larger than anything my family had ever imagined building. "I am proposing a partnership to develop ethical real estate projects in American markets," she explained. "Your artistic vision combined with my resources could create housing developments that prioritize community welfare over maximum profits. But I needed assurance that you possessed integrity that could withstand the temptations that corrupted your family." The offer was staggering in its implications. Partnership with Katerina could provide financial security beyond anything I had ever dreamed, while also allowing me to pursue development projects that aligned with my artistic and moral principles. It was everything I had ever wanted but never dared hope for. "What about my family?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Katerina's expression hardened slightly as she gestured toward additional documents on the tablet. "Federal investigators have been building cases against Clark Real Estate for 8 months. Your art exhibition provided public attention that accelerated their timeline, but the investigations began long before your paintings drew media coverage." She showed me FBI surveillance photos of my father accepting cash payments from construction contractors, email communications, discussing illegal dumping of construction waste and financial records proving systematic tax fraud spanning more than 5 years. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Your family will face federal charges within the next 72 hours. Katerina continued, matter-of-factly. Asset seizure, criminal prosecution, and civil lawsuits from tenants and municipalities will destroy their business and personal wealth. The question is whether you choose to rebuild something better from the wreckage or allow their corruption to define your family's legacy forever. Standing in that circle of vehicles with snow falling around us, I faced the most important decision of my life. I could walk away from everything connected to my family's crimes and start fresh somewhere else, or I could use this unexpected opportunity to transform their destructive legacy into something that helped rather than harmed the communities they had exploited. Looking at Katerina's confident expression, I realized that my impulsive generosity with the boots hadn't just saved her feet from frostbite. It had earned me a chance to become someone my family could never understand, a person who used power and wealth to create justice rather than perpetuate inequality. I accept your partnership offer. I said, my voice gaining strength as I committed to a future that would require courage I wasn't sure I possessed yet. Katerina smiled with satisfaction. Excellent. Now let's discuss what happens to your family when the federal agents arrive to execute their arrest warrants tomorrow morning. Katerina led me to the central BMW where the interior revealed technology that resembled a mobile command center more than luxury transportation. Multiple computer screens displayed real-time data feeds, legal documents, and surveillance footage that documented the full scope of my family's criminal activities. Your father's arrest warrant will be executed at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, Katerina explained as we settled into heated leather seats that felt like paradise after our exposure to the blizzard. Tax evasion, conspiracy to commit fraud, violation of environmental protection laws, and racketeering charges that carry potential sentences of 20 to 30 years. The screens showed FBI surveillance teams positioned around my parents' house, federal agents reviewing evidence files, and prosecutors preparing court documents that would destroy everything my family had built over 3 decades. The operation's sophistication indicated months of careful planning that had nothing to do with my recent art exhibition. How long have you been involved in this investigation? I asked, trying to understand my role in events that seemed far beyond anything I could have influenced. I first encountered Clark Real Estate 18 months ago when they attempted to purchase property in Albany that I was also considering. Katerina replied, pulling up financial records on one of the tablets. Their negotiation tactics included bribery, intimidation, and falsified environmental impact assessments that would have endangered a residential neighborhood. She showed me recorded phone conversations between my father and city planning officials documenting cash payments designed to expedite permits for construction projects that violated multiple safety codes. The recordings were crystal clear, leaving no doubt about intent or criminal culpability. I began investigating their business practices as due diligence for my own potential investments. Katerina continued, what I discovered was systematic corruption, spanning years of operations with victims, including low-income tenants, municipal governments, and environmental protection agencies. Additional screens displayed photographs of substandard housing that Clark Real Estate rented to families who couldn't afford better alternatives. Broken heating systems, water, damage, electrical hazards, and rodent infestations that my father ignored while collecting full rent payments from tenants who had nowhere else to go. The Riverside Apartments complex that you featured in your painting, Katerina pulled up a detailed report that made my stomach churn with disgust. 47 housing code violations, 14 families with children under 5 years old exposed to lead paint and a heating system that hasn't worked properly in 3 winters. My artistic representation of that building had been based on aesthetic observation, not knowledge of the human suffering hidden behind its deteriorating facade. Learning that real families were enduring dangerous living conditions while my father profited from their desperation made me question everything I thought I knew about his character. Jennifer's legal work provided the framework that made these violations appear legitimate. Katerina added displaying contracts and legal documents that demonstrated my sister's complicity. She created corporate structures designed to limit liability while maximizing profit extraction from properties that should have been condemned. The evidence painted Jennifer as an active participant in criminal conspiracy rather than simply a successful attorney who occasionally handled family business. Her law firm specialized in helping developers navigate regulations in ways that prioritized client profits over public safety. Both your parents and your sister will face federal charges, Katerina stated matter-of-factly. Asset forfeiture will claim their personal property, business holdings, and financial accounts. Within 6 months, they will have nothing except legal debts that could take decades to resolve. An associate handed Katerina additional files containing victim impact statements from families who had suffered due to Clark Real Estate's practices. Elderly tenants forced from their homes by illegal eviction tactics, children hospitalized due to environmental hazards, small business owners bankrupted by my father's fraudulent development projects. This is why I needed to assess your character so carefully, Katerina explained. These victims deserve justice and compensation, but they also deserve leadership that will prevent future exploitation. Your artistic work suggested you might possess the moral courage necessary for that responsibility. She pulled up architectural plans and financial projections for development projects that prioritized affordability, sustainability, and community welfare over maximum profit extraction. The plans represented everything my family's business should have been, but never was ethical development that improved lives rather than exploiting vulnerabilities. Volkov International wants to purchase Clark Real Estate's property holdings at federal auction. Katerina continued, with your partnership, we could transform those properties into model communities that demonstrate how ethical development can be both profitable and socially responsible. The tablet displayed renovation plans for the Riverside apartments that would eliminate code violations, add community spaces, and reduce rent to affordable levels while still generating reasonable returns for investors. Similar plans existed for dozens of other properties that would be available after asset forfeiture proceedings concluded. What would happen to the current tenants during renovations? I asked, thinking about the families who were already struggling with substandard conditions and couldn't afford displacement. Katerina smiled at my question. Temporary relocation to comparable housing at our expense, guaranteed right to return at reduced rent and compensation for the unsafe conditions they endured under your father's management. No one suffers additional hardship because of our improvements. Her answer demonstrated the philosophical difference between ethical development and exploitation. Where my family saw tenants as income sources to be maximized, Katerina viewed them as human beings, deserving safe, affordable housing and respectful treatment. The federal prosecutors want your cooperation as a witness. Katerina added, handing me legal documents that outlined potential plea agreements for family members. Your artistic documentation of property conditions provides crucial evidence, and your testimony about family conversations could strengthen cases against all 3 defendants. The request placed me in an impossible position between family loyalty and justice for their victims. Cooperating with prosecutors would guarantee my parents' and sisters' convictions while providing closure for families they had harmed. Refusing cooperation might reduce their sentences, but would also deny justice to innocent people who deserved accountability. I need time to consider testifying against my family. I said, though deep down, I already knew what choice my conscience would demand. Of course, Katerina replied respectfully. But consider this, your cooperation could ensure reduced sentences in exchange for full restitution to victims. Your family's cooperation could help them rebuild their lives on ethical foundations after serving appropriate penalties for their crimes. She showed me projected timelines for legal proceedings that would unfold over the next 2 years. Federal trials, civil lawsuits, asset distribution, and rehabilitation programs that could help my family transition to legitimate livelihoods after paying their debt to society. Your art exhibition wasn't the cause of their downfall, Katerina emphasized. It was a symptom of moral courage that distinguished you from family members who prioritized wealth over integrity. That distinction is why you're sitting in this car as my potential partner instead of awaiting arrest with them. Looking at the evidence surrounding us, I realized that my family's rejection tonight had actually saved me from being implicated in their criminal conspiracy. If I had joined Clark Real Estate, as they always wanted, I would be facing federal charges alongside them instead of being offered a chance to build something better from the ruins of their corruption. When do the arrests happen? Why? I asked, accepting that their downfall was inevitable, regardless of my involvement. Katerina checked her watch. In approximately 7 hours. By this time tomorrow night, your family will be in federal custody. Their assets will be frozen and their business will be under government control, pending auction proceedings. The weight of that timeline hit me with devastating finality. Whatever happened between us now would be our last communication as free individuals rather than federal defendants fighting for their futures. My rejection from Christmas dinner had been the final moment of our old relationship before everything changed forever. I want to call them, I said, suddenly realizing I needed closure before their arrest made normal conversation impossible. Katerina handed me a secure phone. Say whatever you need to say, Sarah, but remember that by tomorrow evening, you'll have the power to either help them rebuild their lives ethically or watch them suffer the full consequences of their choices without any possibility of redemption. The secure phone trembled in my hands as I dialed my parents' number, knowing this would be our final conversation before federal agents transformed their lives forever. Snow continued falling outside the BMW's tinted windows, while Katerina's associates monitored law enforcement communications and news broadcasts that would soon carry breaking stories about Clark Real Estate's collapse. Margaret answered on the second ring, her voice still cold from our earlier confrontation. Sarah, if you're calling to grovel for another chance, you can save your breath. Your father and I meant what we said about you being unwelcome here. Mom, I'm calling to warn you, I said, my throat tight with emotions I couldn't fully identify. Federal agents are going to arrest Dad in the morning for tax evasion, fraud, and racketeering. Jennifer will be charged as a co-conspirator. You need to contact lawyers immediately. The silence that followed lasted so long, I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Margaret spoke again, her voice carried terror that I had never heard before. What are you talking about? How could you possibly know about federal investigations? Because I've been meeting with people who have been watching our family for months, I replied, glancing at Katerina, who was monitoring news feeds on multiple screens. My art exhibition didn't cause this investigation, Mom. It just provided additional evidence for cases they were already building. I could hear frantic whispers in the background as Margaret shared the information with my father and Jennifer. Their Christmas celebration was transforming into crisis management sessions that would determine whether they spent the next decades in prison or found ways to minimize the devastation heading toward them. "You're lying." Jennifer's voice came through the phone, having apparently grabbed it from our mother. "You're making this up to get revenge because we threw you out. No one is investigating Clark Real Estate." "Jennifer, I'm looking at surveillance photos of Dad accepting cash payments from contractors, recorded phone calls about illegal waste dumping, and financial records proving years of tax fraud. The evidence is overwhelming." Katerina handed me additional documents as Jennifer's breathing became audible over the phone. Bank account records showing offshore transactions, EPA violation reports, and tenant complaints that documented systematic abuse of vulnerable families who trusted Clark Real Estate to provide safe housing. Even if investigations exist, Jennifer said her lawyer instincts kicking in despite her obvious panic. Cooperation with federal prosecutors could result in reduced charges and plea bargain opportunities. Her immediate shift toward legal strategy rather than denial confirmed that she knew exactly which criminal activities could be discovered if investigators looked carefully enough. My sister had been actively participating in covering up violations rather than simply providing routine legal services. "The investigators want my cooperation as a witness." I continued watching Katerina's expression for guidance about how much information to reveal. "My artistic documentation of property conditions provides evidence, and my testimony about family conversations could strengthen their cases." "You wouldn't testify against your own family." Margaret's voice returned, now carrying desperation that made my chest ache with sympathy, despite everything they had done to me tonight. "I don't know yet," I admitted honestly, "but I do know that families who trusted Clark Real Estate are living in dangerous conditions while paying full rent for housing that should be condemned. Someone needs to speak for them if they're going to get justice." Robert's voice boomed in the background, apparently directing Jennifer to contact their attorney and begin damage control procedures that might minimize their legal exposure. Their Christmas celebration had officially ended, replaced by emergency strategy sessions that would continue until federal agents arrived. "Sarah," Margaret said, her voice breaking, "can you help us? Do these people you're working with have any influence over the prosecution decisions?" The question revealed how completely they misunderstood my situation. They still viewed me as someone who could be useful to them rather than recognizing that I had become someone committed to ethical principles that contradicted everything their business represented. "Mom, the only way anyone can help you now is by ensuring justice for your victims," I replied. "That means full restitution, property improvements, and accountability for every family you've harmed through substandard housing and fraudulent business practices." Katerina's phone rang with updates from her associates monitoring law enforcement frequencies. Federal teams were moving into position around key locations. Media outlets were receiving advance notification about morning arrests, and prosecutors were finalizing paperwork that would be served within hours. "The arrests will be public, I warned them. News crews will be filming everything, and your business practices will be front-page stories in every regional newspaper. You need to be prepared for complete exposure of everything you've hidden." Jennifer's voice returned now, professionally controlled despite the circumstances. "If you're going to cooperate with prosecutors, we need advance warning about your testimony so we can prepare adequate defense strategies." Her request demonstrated that she still viewed this as a legal problem to be managed rather than a moral crisis requiring fundamental changes in character. Even facing federal charges, her primary concern was manipulation rather than accountability. "I'll testify truthfully about what I observed and experienced," I said firmly. Nothing more, nothing less. But Jennifer, you should know that victims deserve justice, and I won't help you avoid consequences for actions that harmed innocent families. The call ended without traditional expressions of love or hope for reconciliation. Our family relationships had been severed not just by tonight's rejection, but by fundamental disagreements about ethics that made genuine connection impossible until they committed to moral transformation. Katerina was watching news broadcasts that showed FBI vehicles staging near multiple locations throughout the Albany area. Local reporters were already speculating about major law enforcement operations planned for tomorrow morning, though they hadn't yet identified specific targets. Are you prepared for what happens when this becomes public? Katerina asked gently. Your family's crimes will be national news, and your role as a witness will draw significant media attention. I thought about the implications of becoming the family member who exposed criminal activity rather than participating in cover-up efforts. Public scrutiny, social media, commentary, and potential threats from people who sympathized with my parents' position as successful business owners facing federal prosecution. It's better than being someone who stayed silent while innocent families suffered, I replied, feeling certainty crystallize despite my fears about the consequences. Katerina smiled with approval. That attitude is exactly why you're the right partner for rebuilding ethical development practices in these communities. Your commitment to justice over comfort demonstrates exactly the leadership these victims deserve. Her tablet displayed architectural plans for community centers, playgrounds, and affordable housing units that could replace the substandard properties my family had exploited for profit. The designs prioritized human dignity and social connection over cost minimization, representing everything Clark Real Estate could have been but never was. Tomorrow morning will be difficult for you, Katerina acknowledged. But tomorrow evening, we begin planning developments that prove ethical business practices can be more profitable than criminal exploitation. Looking at those plans while snow continued falling outside, I felt hope beginning to replace the despair that had characterized this entire day. My family's rejection had freed me to become someone I had never imagined possible, a person with resources, influence, and moral clarity sufficient to create positive change in communities that desperately needed ethical leadership. The woman who had been thrown out of her childhood home in a blizzard was about to become someone with the power to transform the very properties that had been used to harm innocent families. It was exactly the kind of poetic justice that my artistic sensibilities could appreciate, even as my heart ached for the family relationships that would be lost in the process. Dawn broke gray and cold as news vans surrounded my parents' estate and federal agents executed arrest warrants with precision that left no doubt about the charge's seriousness. I watched the live television coverage from Katerina's hotel suite, my coffee growing cold, as CNN showed my father in handcuffs being led to a black SUV, while reporters shouted questions about Clark Real Estate's criminal conspiracy. Jennifer appeared in a separate news clip, her perfect composure finally cracking as FBI agents searched her law office and seized computers containing evidence of her participation in covering up environmental violations and tax fraud. The successful attorney who had mocked my struggles 12 hours earlier now faced disbarment proceedings and potential prison time. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters seeking statements about my family's arrests and my role as a potential witness in federal prosecutions. Katerina's public relations team had prepared responses that positioned me as someone committed to justice for victims rather than someone seeking revenge against relatives who had rejected me. Ms. Clark's cooperation with federal investigators reflects her commitment to ensuring accountability for vulnerable families who were harmed by predatory business practices. The statement read, "She believes that justice requires transparency in full restitution, regardless of personal relationships or family loyalty." By noon, the media coverage had expanded from local news to national networks, highlighting the broader implications of real estate fraud in American cities. My art exhibition was featured prominently as evidence that someone within the Clark family had been trying to expose corruption even before federal investigators revealed the criminal conspiracy. CNN ran a segment titled "The Whistleblower Daughter" that portrayed me as someone who had courageously chosen artistic integrity over family wealth, inadvertently providing evidence that helped prosecutors build cases against systematic exploitation of low-income tenants. The narrative was mostly accurate, though it simplified complex motivations into a story about good versus evil that felt strange to watch. At 3 o'clock, my phone rang with a call from Hartford County Jail. Jennifer's name appeared on the screen, and I hesitated before accepting a conversation that would be recorded and potentially used as evidence in her prosecution. "Sarah?" Jennifer's voice sounded broken in ways I had never heard before. "They've frozen all our assets. My house, David's investment, accounts the children's college funds. We have nothing left except legal debts that could take decades to pay." The devastation in her voice triggered sympathy, despite everything she had done to me over the years. This was still my sister, reduced from successful professional to federal defendant, facing the possibility of spending her children's childhood years in prison. "I'm sorry this happened," I said honestly. "But Jennifer, the evidence shows systematic harm to families who trusted Clark Real Estate to provide safe housing. Someone has to answer for that suffering." "You're going to testify against us," she stated flatly. "Your own family." "I'm going to testify truthfully about what I observed. Whether that helps or hurts your defense depends on what you choose to do about making things right with the people you harmed." Jennifer was quiet for several minutes before responding. "The prosecutors are offering plea bargains in exchange for complete cooperation and full restitution to victims. If we cooperate, prison sentences could be reduced significantly." Her willingness to consider cooperation suggested that the evidence against them was overwhelming enough to make defense strategies essentially hopeless. Federal prosecutors only offered plea bargains when they were confident about securing convictions, regardless of defendant cooperation. "What does cooperation involve?" I asked, curious about whether my family was prepared to take genuine responsibility for their actions. Complete financial disclosure testimony against co-conspirators who enabled the fraud and agreement to liquidate all personal assets for victim compensation, Jennifer replied. Plus, community service requirements and supervised probation that could last years after prison release. The terms suggested prosecutors were more interested in justice for victims than maximum punishment for perpetrators. If my family genuinely cooperated and made full restitution, they could rebuild their lives on ethical foundations after serving appropriate penalties. "That sounds fair," I said. "It gives victims the compensation they deserve while offering you a chance to prove you've learned from your mistakes." "Fair." Jennifer's voice carried bitter laughter. "Sarah, do you understand what complete financial disclosure means? They want access to every account, every investment, every asset we've accumulated over 30 years. We'll lose everything." Her response revealed that she still prioritized personal wealth over victim welfare, viewing restitution as punishment rather than justice. Even facing federal charges, Jennifer seemed more concerned about protecting assets than acknowledging the human cost of their criminal activities. You'll lose money that was earned through illegal activities that harmed innocent families, I corrected. Those families deserve compensation for the unsafe conditions they endured while paying full rent for housing that should have been condemned. My phone beeped with another call from my parents' number. I conferenced them into the conversation, creating a three-way discussion that would determine whether our family relationships could survive their criminal prosecutions. Sarah. Robert's voice carried exhaustion and defeat that I had never heard from him before. The prosecutors say your artistic documentation of property conditions provides crucial evidence for their cases. Your paintings show systematic negligence that supports criminal charges. My paintings show reality, Dad. They show what tenants were living with while you ignored maintenance requests and collected rent payments from families who had nowhere else to go. Margaret's voice joined the conversation, trembling with emotions that ranged from anger to desperation. We gave you everything, Sarah. Education opportunities, financial support when you needed it. How can you repay that by helping send us to prison? Her question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had always characterized our relationship. She viewed my cooperation with prosecutors as betrayal of family loyalty rather than commitment to ethical principles that should have guided their business practices from the beginning. You gave me advantages that came from exploiting vulnerable families, I replied. My college tuition was paid with money that should have gone to heating repairs and lead paint remediation. Everything I received was built on other people's suffering. The line was quiet for several moments before Robert spoke with resignation that suggested acceptance of their situation's reality. The plea bargain requires us to allocate our assets for victim compensation and agree to ethical business practices if we ever work in real estate again. It's essentially starting over from nothing. Starting over with knowledge about how to avoid harming people, I corrected. Starting over with understanding that business success doesn't justify causing suffering. That's not nothing, Dad. That's everything. Jennifer's voice returned with professional curiosity that suggested her legal training was helping her process the implications of their situation. If we cooperate fully in complete restitution, would you consider helping us rebuild legitimate business operations after we serve our sentences? Kusao. Her question offered the possibility of family reconciliation based on genuine moral transformation rather than superficial apologies designed to manipulate forgiveness. If they truly learned from their mistakes and committed to ethical practices, working together could create something better than what they had destroyed. If you prove through actions that you've genuinely changed, I said carefully, and if victims receive full justice, then yes, I would consider helping you build something legitimate. Katerina entered the hotel room with legal documents that outlined the partnership structure for our ethical development company. The papers included provisions for employing formerly incarcerated individuals who demonstrated commitment to community service, potentially offering my family meaningful roles in restoring the neighborhoods their crimes had damaged. But understand, I continued, any future relationship depends on you choosing justice for victims over protection of your own interests. If you're not prepared to put their welfare first, then we have nothing to discuss. The conversation ended with agreements to meet after their sentencing hearings to discuss potential cooperation on victim restitution and community rebuilding projects. Our family relationships would be rebuilt from scratch based on shared commitment to ethical principles rather than unconditional loyalty that enabled harmful behavior. Looking out the hotel window at the snow-covered city that contained dozens of properties my family had mismanaged, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. The people who had raised me were facing consequences for choices that harmed innocent families. But those same consequences created opportunities to transform their legacy from exploitation to healing. Tonight, they would sleep in federal detention facilities, their assets frozen and their reputations destroyed. But tomorrow could begin a process of genuine accountability that might eventually restore both their freedom and their relationships with the daughter they had rejected on Christmas Eve. 1 year later, I stood in the central courtyard of the Riverside Gardens affordable housing complex, watching children play on equipment that had been installed where broken concrete and accumulated trash once created hazards for families with nowhere else to live. The December afternoon was crisp and clear, with early snow dusting the community garden beds that would bloom again in spring with vegetables grown by residents who now owned their own small plots of land. Maya Rodriguez, age 7, tugged on my coat sleeve and pointed toward the new playground structure with excitement that made my heart swell with satisfaction. 18 months ago, Maya's family had been living in a moldy one-bedroom apartment with broken windows and no heat, paying $800 monthly to Clark Real Estate for housing that should have been condemned. Today, they owned a renovated 2-bedroom unit with modern appliances, safe electrical systems, and affordable monthly payments that would build equity instead of enriching negligent landlords. "Ms. Sarah, will you push me on the swings?" Maya asked with the confidence of a child who had learned to trust adults to keep their promises about creating better circumstances. "Of course," I replied, thinking about how different the scene was from the vision I'd had when first viewing this property through my artist's eyes 2 years earlier. Then I had seen only deterioration and neglect worthy of documentation in paintings that criticized urban development practices. Now I saw a thriving community that proved ethical development could be both profitable and transformative for families who deserved better than exploitation. Katerina approached from the community center building carrying architectural plans for our next project in Troy, where 300 families were currently living in substandard housing that reminded me uncomfortably of conditions my own family had once perpetuated. Her integration into American business culture had been seamless, but she maintained the moral clarity that made our partnership both productive and personally meaningful. The Troy City Council approved our renovation proposal unanimously. She reported with satisfaction full environmental remediation, individual ownership transition programs, and community support services that will help families build long-term stability. Our company, Restoration Development Partners, had transformed 17 properties over the past year, housing nearly 2,000 people in conditions that prioritize dignity and safety over maximum profit extraction. Federal prosecutors had featured our work prominently during victim restitution hearings, demonstrating how crime proceeds could be converted into community assets that repaired some of the damage caused by predatory business practices. My phone rang with a call from Hartford Correctional Facility, where my father was serving his 18-month sentence for tax evasion and fraud. Robert had cooperated fully with federal prosecutors, providing testimony that enabled convictions against 12 other developers who had participated in similar schemes throughout the region. His cooperation had earned sentence reductions and work release privileges that allowed him to contribute to community rebuilding projects. "Sarah, I wanted to call before visiting hours begin." Robert's voice carried humility that had replaced the arrogance I remembered from our previous relationship. "Jennifer and I have completed the Victim Impact Awareness Program, and we're ready to begin supervised community service if you think our help would be beneficial." Prison had changed my father in fundamental ways that extended beyond simple acknowledgement of legal wrongdoing. The man who had built his identity around financial dominance and social status had learned to find meaning in rehabilitation programs that focused on understanding the human cost of his choices rather than minimizing personal consequences. The Residents' Council voted to approve your participation in renovation work, I told him, but you'll be working alongside people whose lives were damaged by Clark Real Estate's practices. You'll hear their stories directly, and you'll need to demonstrate through actions that you genuinely understand why your business model was wrong. I understand, Robert replied. And Sarah, I want you to know that throwing you out on Christmas Eve was the worst decision I've ever made. Not just because it led to our exposure, but because it revealed how completely I had lost sight of what actually matters in life. His apology addressed the personal hurt that had lingered despite my professional success and financial security. The rejection had been devastating, not just practically, but emotionally representing their final judgment that my values were incompatible with family membership. Learning that this judgment had been wrong about both ethics and practical outcomes created a sense of vindication that facilitated genuine forgiveness. I've learned to be grateful for that night, I told him honestly. If you hadn't thrown me out, I would never have met Katerina, and we wouldn't have been able to create something better from the wreckage of your old business model. Jennifer's voice joined the conversation through a three-way call from the women's facility where she was completing her 12-month sentence. Her legal license had been suspended permanently, but she was training in social work with plans to advocate for tenant rights after her release. Sarah, the families we're going to be working with have every right to refuse our help, Jennifer said with the professional directness that had characterized her legal career. If my presence makes them uncomfortable, I'll find other ways to contribute to restitution efforts. Her willingness to prioritize victim comfort over her own rehabilitation needs demonstrated genuine growth beyond what sentencing requirements demanded. The sister who had mocked my struggles was becoming someone who understood that earning forgiveness required sustained evidence of changed priorities rather than superficial expressions of remorse. The Residents' Council wants to meet with both of you before making final decisions about your involvement, I explained. They've prepared questions about your understanding of how your actions affected their families, and they want honest responses about your motivations for seeking to help with renovations. Maya Rodriguez finished her playground adventure and approached with the directness that made children excellent judges of adult character. Ms. Sarah, are those the people who used to own our old apartment building? Yes, Maya. They made some very bad decisions that hurt your family and many others. Now they're trying to learn from those mistakes and help fix the problems they caused. Maya considered this information with the seriousness that characterized her approach to adult conversations. Will they say, "Sorry to my mama for the broken heater and the mice in the kitchen"? Her question captured the essence of what genuine accountability required: specific acknowledgement of particular harms to individual families, rather than general expressions of regret about legal consequences. Maya's mother had worked double shifts as a hospital aide while living in conditions that made her children sick, paying rent that could have covered a decent apartment if honest landlords had been willing to accept reasonable profits. They'll have the chance to say sorry if your mama wants to hear it, I told Maya. But they'll have to prove they mean it by helping make sure no other families have to live with broken heaters and mice. Christmas Eve marked exactly 1 year since the night that transformed all of our lives through a series of choices that seemed insignificant at the time but created consequences none of us could have anticipated. I had planned to spend the evening alone in my renovated studio apartment, working on paintings that celebrated community transformation rather than documenting urban decay. Instead, I found myself at Hartford Correctional Facility for the first family visit that felt genuinely healing rather than obligatory. My parents and Jennifer looked different in their gray uniforms, but more importantly, they sounded different when they talked about their plans for contributing to community rebuilding efforts after their releases. I understand now that throwing you out that night was exactly what needed to happen. Margaret said, her voice carrying wonder rather than regret. If we had convinced you to stay quiet about our business practices, dozens more families would have suffered while we continued stealing from people who trusted us to provide safe housing. Her perspective demonstrated the moral growth that made reconciliation possible. Instead of viewing their exposure as betrayal by an ungrateful daughter, she recognized that my cooperation with prosecutors had prevented additional harm to vulnerable families who deserved protection rather than exploitation. Your art exhibition wasn't an attack on our family, Robert added, with understanding that came too late to prevent their criminal prosecutions, but early enough to guide their rehabilitation efforts. It was an attempt to wake us up to what we had become. We were too arrogant to listen then, but we're listening now. But Jennifer held up letters from 3 families whose children had been hospitalized due to environmental hazards in Clark real estate properties. The letters thanked our family for the full restitution payments that covered medical expenses and allowed them to move to safer housing while their old apartments underwent complete renovation. These families forgave us, Jennifer said with amazement. After everything we put them through, they're willing to give us chances to prove we've changed. That kind of grace is something I never understood when I thought success meant accumulating as much wealth as possible. Their transformation from people who prioritize money over morality into individuals committed to repairing the damage they had caused represented exactly the kind of character development that made our criminal justice system's rehabilitation goals achievable. They were becoming people worthy of the second chances that victim families were graciously offering. As visiting hours ended and I prepared to return to Restoration Development Partners for our evening planning meeting, Margaret asked the question that would define our family's future relationships. When we're released, can we work together to build something that helps people instead of hurting them? Yes, I replied without hesitation, but only if you demonstrate every single day that you've truly learned the difference between legitimate business success and criminal exploitation of vulnerable people. The drive back to the office took me through neighborhoods where our renovation projects were creating affordable housing, community gardens, and support services that address the root causes of housing instability rather than profiting from desperation. Former Clark real estate properties had been transformed into models of ethical development that attracted national attention from urban planners seeking alternatives to gentrification and displacement. Katerina was waiting with champagne and financial reports, showing that our ethical approach had generated profits exceeding what my family's exploitative practices had ever achieved. Treating tenants with dignity, maintaining properties properly, and investing in community welfare had created business success that was both sustainable and socially responsible. To Christmas Eve, revelations. Katerina proposed as we toasted the anniversary of our unlikely partnership. Sometimes the worst nights of our lives become doorways to possibilities we never imagined. Looking out at the snow-covered city that contained thousands of families living in housing that prioritized their welfare over investor profits, I felt profound gratitude for the series of choices that had led to this moment. My family's rejection had freed me to become someone they could eventually respect. Their criminal prosecution had enabled justice for their victims, and our partnership with Katerina had proven that business success and social responsibility were compatible goals rather than competing priorities. The barefoot woman on a park bench had transformed into the most trusted business partner I could have asked for my artistic documentation of urban decay, had evolved into blueprints for community restoration, and my family's criminal conspiracy had become the foundation for rehabilitation programs that helped both offenders and victims heal from systematic exploitation. Have you ever experienced a moment when what seemed like the worst rejection of your life actually opened doors to opportunities you never knew existed? I'd love to hear about times when family conflict led to personal growth and positive change in your own life. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help others find hope during their own difficult family situations. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about resilience, redemption, and the surprising ways that compassion can transform lives. Share this story with anyone who might need encouragement about turning setbacks into comebacks, and remember that sometimes being rejected by the wrong people leads to acceptance by the right ones. Thank you for joining me today, and may your own Christmas season be filled with reconciliation, understanding, and hope for new beginnings that honor both justice and forgiveness.